Phil. But I'll just get, for the benefit of the crowd that's joining us on the Connected program, just wanted to say thank you very much to Phil, Taha, and Brady just for joining us and sharing some insights with us this morning. It's the fun part of the course is when we get to hear from awesome people like yourself, and we get to actually see that you're real and that you have a conversation outside of videos, which is cool. And so lovely to have you here. And as I said, jump off whenever you need to jump off. We'll try and wrap up at 7:40 my time, so 36 minutes from now. But Taha, I'm going to kick off with you first. Just introduce yourself. Tell us where you're working at the moment and your principal interest in the higher education space.
Sure. So it's a pleasure to meet everybody. My name is Taha. I started off my career as a high school English teacher, and I very quickly realized that data was not used as robustly in other classrooms as it was being used in mine, and I became really interested in what data could tell me more about what my kids needed support on and how I can fine-tune my curriculum. And my role transitioned. I became the assistant principal of the school, and then left my role to pursue my graduate work in data science. I now work for a nonprofit ed tech venture called Quill. We are building an online learning experience where students can get feedback on their writing using AI. I am working on a specific, I'm primarily interested in the learning analytics space, thinking about what the data on our student achievement is telling us and how that could support teachers in the classroom and how that could support curriculum writing in general. And so, yeah. Yeah.
Really enjoy your commentary on things. You've got really great big picture insights on this stuff, and so it's always fascinating to have a conversation with Taha. So thanks so much for joining us. Phil, over to you.
Hi, I'm Phil. I'm the Chief Solutions Officer for Analyticus. My primary interest is using analytics, especially artificial intelligence, machine learning, and applying them to student retention, progression, cognition.
And always succinct. So that's why I said I would have preferred the bourbon answer, because it would have been a lot longer and more full. But Phil, yeah, also just recently did a podcast with, or just released a podcast with Phil, and just got such a wealth of information in this space. And so really great to have you here. Brady, over to you.
Yeah, I'm in a little bit different part of the ed tech data world, where I primarily work in aggregating data about what's happening in the broader market and what trends we can observe emerging from that data. And so looking at how universities are working with companies to implement new strategies like online learning, like micro-credentials, like diversifying revenue with international students, like servicing students in other ways, like experiential learning and tutoring. So it's a lot of data, but I'm not quite as close to the kind of gold standard that a couple of the other panel members are, that are working on directly helping the students. So happy to be here.
Yeah, it's cool because data is one of those things that goes everywhere, and it scaffolds across the whole spectrum. And Brady, your work is particularly important when you're looking at the trends happening in the space, as you said, but will be very useful in just getting an aggregated view of who else is doing well in this space, who has some interesting insights and the like. So I'll probably just kick over to Taha just to start off with. What are you seeing that's interesting in the retention world, and what was illuminating for you? Because you've recently joined Quill, so to speak. Like, what was illuminating from your journey, and what did you discover that was surprising for you?
Yeah, I think right now we're kind of coming towards like at the tail end of remote learning, and as students are going back to classroom, we're seeing less students using the portal on a more frequent basis. But I think the primary interest right now is thinking a lot about what trends and achievement that we saw on the Quill platform in the past year are really going to impact how what gaps or what deficiencies that teachers need to work on in the upcoming school year as we move back to in-person. And so I think that is a primary interest right now. And I think in many ways, teachers have relied on data this past year more than other years because they've had to because they're not in the classroom. That's an exciting new frontier because we and I primarily think that this is going to stick around a lot longer, and it's going to be one of the kind of the pros of the COVID remote learning world is we totally upskilled a lot of teachers in understanding data and using data because they had to, and now it's about how do we do that in a way that is adding to the classroom in a world where we're not replacing the classroom anymore. And so that's a conversation that's ongoing, and it's an interest that's ongoing that we want data now to augment the classroom experience, not just to be used in a world where there is no classroom.
Yeah, Todd, I'm fascinated just to extend on one of those points. So what was the data proficiency like when you started? Just out of interest, like, what do you think as a yardstick? How would you have measured it relative to what it is now? And then to your point around the augmentation, are you looking at different product layers now that can surface up data in different ways to enhance that teaching experience now as a result of post-COVID or during the latter part of COVID, hopefully?
Sure. So the way we've been kind of really thinking about this is the requests that we've been getting from teachers about what kind of data they want to see. And we definitely have to transform what the teacher dashboard looks like. Prior to COVID or in early COVID, our dashboard was barely a dashboard, and it didn't have, it had larger trend data, student averages, proficiency across cohorts, but nothing really specific, nothing specific about where students were struggling at an individual level. But we saw that in the past year, we've had that become a really top request from teachers. And so we've kind of been thinking about, okay, how is the data landscape changing based on the product needs and needs of teachers, and how our dashboard has evolved because of that, and how more intensive our dashboard has become. And we definitely see a shift from teachers being interested in big picture data to now teachers being interested in really individual student by student data. I think that is a big shift, and that is indicative of a greater proficiency and interest in data than we've ever seen before.
Very nice point. Phil, you're nodding your head. Tell me, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree. I think the experience that a lot of teachers have had, professors, etc., have had this last year with COVID is really interesting, because a lot of them were never exposed to using data to help their students before. They were always reliant upon what happened when you and I were in university, that you went to a class, the professor was able to see you, they had all the paralinguistic cues to go along with a face-to-face class. They could ascertain what was going on, and if they really were involved, do interventions. Now, those faculty who are really involved with their students have started relying more and more on looking at data. So we're getting a de facto data-driven culture in a lot of universities that's coming up from the bottom instead of coming down from the top like it previously was. So I think that's right, spot on.
And have you also seen the proficiency improvement, Phil? Like, have you seen that Like anecdotally, can you attest to the fact that people understand the data better? Like the questions they're asking are more intelligent and thought-provoking for you, that you can gauge that?
Well, in some cases. So the first step, like in our case, we help provision institutions with their analytics, okay? And we do the initial training, a train the trainer model, if you will, where that all propagates downward. Now, the real catch becomes how well those initial people who were involved in the training picked it up and have conveyed the same message down as they start training the folks below them. So where we see really good support, then yes, that's propagating. Where it's not, it's still very problematic. I mean, we can have the best analytics in the world, but unless you have effective change management strategies within inside of the institution, it's really for naught, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. So thanks for that. So Brady, just to bring you into the conversation here about data proficiency more generally, and people becoming more discerning about data. I mean, I know that you were feeding some of the Holon IQ machine. You've got your 32 Edu business that does very similar things in some respects. Are you starting to see leaders of these institutions and organizations become more reliant on data to make informed decisions, like Phil and Taha were mentioning, is that it's permeating the organization? And like what from your perspective, are you seeing any trends along those lines that are exciting for you?
I mean, in a sense, we are starting to see a little bit more proficiency in terms of using the data that's at hand to make these strategic decisions. And a part of that is by virtue of the fact that the industry that supplies that data hasn't really existed in this scope up until the past few years. And so there was never really an opportunity for any wholesale implementation of these kind of things. Everything had to be done on an ad hoc basis, and you could never really dashboardize something to be feeding your constant learning about what's happening in your local area or whatever your strategic markets are. So not quite as much as we might have hoped yet. And it is interesting that that's the case, because by and large, it does feel like we see a little bit more quick movement on the marketing side of the data implementation in higher education than the student performance side. And part of that is because of the injection of industry at that point. Part of that is because it's more tangibly connected to the bottom line. But it seems like we're getting close to this inflection point where work like Taha and Phil are doing is starting to catch up and really become the focal point and move past us.
Yeah, you've stated so many interesting points there, and yes, like I'm very familiar with the marketing dashboards. Are incredibly impressive in some of these outfits, because you're spending a truckload of money and you want to know that there's good return on investment. At the same time, we are starting to see shifts, as Phil would attest to, that we're starting to see that retention game is becoming increasingly important as well. We don't want these students leaving our institution and going somewhere else, and that really does affect the bottom line. So we're starting to see more of an interest in that. And notwithstanding also the fact of Taha, we can rub that into you as well, where you look at the institution's performance of individual teachers. And now you can start saying, well, teacher X and teacher Y perform way better than A, B, and C. And why is that? And they can start questioning the cost base as well, as to, and where training needs to be applied, and these sorts of things. So data is certainly becoming more illuminating for institutions. The data sources, so this is where it all kind of, why I don't think we've seen it is because it hasn't really been built bottom up, in the sense of these technology companies have data at their very core, whereas the institutions that we work with often have archaic technology and it's all disparate, and getting that data is incredibly tough. I mean, I'm not joking when I say I worked at an institution that could not tell at a click of a button or very easily whether a student had logged into a platform or not. So that's the starting point, right? Like that's where some institutions are, and there's some nodding around the room here, so this is not uncommon. So that's the starting point. That's what we have to work with, and that's why I couldn't call well, be too vociferous around the data dashboarding and so on. But tell us about that data collection part of it, and what are we seeing starting to change, if at all? And I'll kick that over to Taha first, because yours is a proprietary platform, so you should have a little bit more smarts than the rest of the systems, I presume.
Yeah, I mean, I've been on both sides of it, all three, as a teacher, as a school administrator, and now on the ed tech side of things. And I think a big part of this is also typically, especially in the New York area, data has been used, like data is a bad word for a lot of teachers. And so it's used to kind of measure or penalize. And so we've run into a lot of teachers not being open to wanting their data being analyzed or wanting to share that data, and then that becomes an administrative issue. And we've kind of pivoted away from thinking about using data to evaluate whether teacher A is better than teacher B, but instead move on evaluating ed tech products or evaluating instructional or curriculum practices or choices. And I think one of the things that you mentioned was like, well, whether someone logged in or logged off, right? We think of that as engagement. And I think this is a really exciting time in the education data space, because up until now, like most educational data is about like, was a student in school today? Yes or no? Like, did a student, like how well did a student do on in an exam or a homework? Like what was the percentage? But now we can actually like look at data of like, where are kids logging on and where are they logging off and where are they trailing in and where are they trailing off? And so we are thinking a lot about this idea of engagement data and how does it reflect on the curriculum, right? If we see, for example, on our platform, if like after activity 4, like kids are logging off, or after activity 6, we see like the number of clicks are decreasing. Like, is that reflecting the fact that, oh, maybe that part of the curriculum isn't engaging enough? Or is this where things get boring or are not effective? And so I think those insights are becoming really, really interesting to us. And they've actually allowed us to have a lot more productive conversations with teachers, because when you tell teachers like, hey, like we're interested in finding out how to retain engagement or how to increase engagement, like teachers really care about that, right? Because they're invested in that. And so we've gotten a lot more traction and excitement thinking about those data points and approaching data from that perspective than in any evaluative sense.
Yeah.
And we're kind of straying away from that entirely.
Yeah, no, and it makes sense. I mean, that framing is very, very, very important. So Phil, can you resonate with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, the data, I would actually, in our case, go down a level below that, because we're dependent upon the data that the institution provides to us. Now, so we've learned to be opportunistic in the way we analyze the data, looking at outcomes, because you're never going to get the same set of variables from any two institutions. You're never going to even get all of the same classes of data, because institutions vary from those who are very, very well organized, have highly structured data warehouses, to those who have literally 10 different databases on campus. So it's across the spectrum. And being able to learn to first sit down and help the institutions find where their data is, because most institutions honestly don't know where their data all resides. Okay, so bringing that together is a chore in and of itself. Now, recently, I've been seeing some, you know, we've seen things done with IMS Global, the Caliper Initiative, et cetera, that look to have common definitions for data. But probably one of the most ambitious things I've seen recently is Microsoft's Open Education Analytics, where they're looking at a complete framework to form a unified data lake for every institution, and they're building a lot of the APIs to help bring that data in and have common federation. So I think that that's a step in the right direction. Now, how many times over the last 20 years have I heard a similar story and it all ended in tears? I mean, more times than any of us can count. So, you know, while it's a great idea, if it comes to fruition and we see institutions starting to buy into a framework, I think that it looks a lot more promising. But the biggest hurdle is always going to be the institutional preparedness, and you know how we get around that is really a good question. Other than every new client sitting down and doing a 8-week discovery with them, I've yet to see anything manifest that has changed that. I'm hoping that, like I said, that the OEA will, but I think we still have a lot of work in front of us.
Mm. And Brady, just a comment that you can comment on any of that, but just an extension of that as well is looking just a little bit out of the box around data availability more generally in the EdTech and higher education ecosystem relative to other industry sectors. Like, what's your opinion on that as well?
So there was actually a kind of an interesting intersection of this discussion with what's happening internally and addressing the students with what's going on externally in the broader market in the past couple of weeks with ClassIn and Engagely both raising a lot of money for this one specific application. And that's something that we've seen happen pretty frequently in recent history, where a new class of tool that's addressing one very specific issue for a student comes up, and it doesn't come up internally from an existing provider. It comes up as a standalone tool. And then now that adds a whole nother layer of complexity and a whole nother place that you have to go and you have to incorporate back into the system. And then you think about all of the things that we're learning that we have to address on behalf of the student, the social aspects of learning, the mental health aspects, those tools getting plugged in. There's the LMS that they're using, and that might not be the only LMS they're using. Then there's additional tacked on learning platforms and the video conferencing tools, and all these tools that keep popping up as a standalone thing that just makes it more and more complex, where in other industries, we see more and more things coming under the umbrella of a few providers that, yeah, like what Salesforce did, you know, they said, we'll basically handle everything for you. And it's interesting that in ed tech, that doesn't seem to happen, that we don't see Blackboard spinning out the next video conferencing tool. We see kind of this preference for staying hyper-focused on your core competency. And there's certainly a case to be made for that. But then in the end, if those things aren't as interoperable as they need to be, then it creates this massively complex data system to where we're not able to learn from the new tools that we're implementing. And it also harms the student because, you know, we see it in organizational psychology all the time that the more tools that you have to log into on a daily basis, the less productive you are. And so we keep adding on more and more things instead of incorporating them into the existing framework. And it's to the detriment of the student to a degree. But there is some kind of attempts to remedy this. Two big examples would be Modern Campus and Anthology, where they were each multiple separate pieces of higher ed technology that were separate entities that came together under one umbrella. And it's that idea of, if we're going to solve this, we're going to have to start figuring out how to work together in a lot more intimate and tangible way. And so those are a couple examples where we do see some attempts to make sure that we don't get out of control with the number of tools being used.
Yeah, it's a really interesting lens on it. And you're right. I mean, of course, the other ERP kind of solutions have been more integrated, and it does seem like it's the Wild West in higher education at the moment. Every small ed tech provider is looking to get a slice of the market, and yes, it is extremely complex for students. I mean, I've just got so many applications, and I've got too many, and like just for learning, that would be enormously frustrating. So I've spoken a lot. We have Ciara, Michaela, Rich joining us on the call. And I know Rich has a question, so I'll probably just kick over to Rich straight away, the one that you posted in the chat. Hello, Rich. Introduce yourself, please, just so that people know who you are.
Yeah, my name's Rich Goldberg. I work for a company called Academic Partnerships. Brady's heard of it. I have a quick question because I actually have a work emergency that has come up and I need to drop off in a moment. So my question was, when we're talking about lack of academic data, how much of that is just FERPA related, as universities aren't really open to sharing that data? I mean, me working with a company that works directly with universities, we have it in our contract that we are able, that we, from a FERPA perspective, have to do the same things the university does. We can't get some of the data that we would like. So I'm wondering how that affects overall transparency as far as student success.
Cool. Good one for you.
So yes, it can be a hindrance, and you're exactly right. Some universities, we sign on where we are the custodian, we have the exact same obligations as they do, and then we have very little problem with it. Actually, GDPR has become a trump card over FERPA. GDPR, especially working outside the US, whenever you're looking at Western Europe, it's even more of a stickler on universities wanting to release that data. So technically, to answer your question, technically, it should not be a stumbling block, because everything we can do, we can house the data in a secure environment. We can assure that all the protocols are there from a security perspective, but it's a political issue really with the universities wanting or being able to give you the data and wanting to be able to give you the data and wanting to cooperate. And also, of course, their legal counsel warning them that they, about all the consequences of that. So it is far more political than technical.
All right. Well, we're getting some nods and Rich has to go. So Ciara, Michaela's unmuted, so she's first in line.
Yeah, I have a question about retention, and perhaps this is also primarily for Phil, as you've worked in this field. Our population of students is 100% online, and we have relatively broad access. This is not an easy population from a retention standpoint, and large proportion of military students who tend to be a lot of in and out. So it's not easy. And with online students in general, applying like high impact practices may or may not work, or you may or may not be able to apply them as such. And then we know what the big variables in terms of predicting retention are: funding, GPA, and there's some issues with reverse causality there of who really persists. And did you not know that from the beginning? But wondering if you've got any stories or things you're seeing appearing in this arena that could potentially support better retention numbers with a population such as the one I described.
So online learning itself has a very long history, and there are a lot of very good practices that developed at some of the institutions that were very early to the game. They were involved with bringing non-traditional students in originally and understanding from a pedagogical perspective, a cognition perspective, how the classes should be structured, etc. Then about a year and a half ago, the world turned upside down and online learning became the Wild West. And everybody was dumped in to environments that they were never prepared to teach or offer courses in many cases. So we basically have a year and a half of skewed data that we're looking at. We're learning what the stumbling blocks are early on for implementing a program, but as far as best practices go, you can still see those embedded within the universities that have been there for a long time. I would say whenever you're looking at a fully online university, while the issues such as funding, et cetera, are right at the top because they are mostly non-traditional students and there's a lot of variance in when they can have funds available. But one of the overriding factors really comes down to some intangibles, or no, I shouldn't say intangibles at all. It's around the effectiveness, cognitive effectiveness on how well the students can absorb materials in an online environment as a face-to-face environment. So the problem becomes one not of understanding who is likely to drop out, but why they're likely to drop out. There are a certain number of people who have very difficult time learning in a technology-mediated environment, regardless of what happens there. However, if we can identify the ones who have a high propensity to learn and focus the efforts, the tutoring and the support efforts on them, and suggest that the others try another format, because inevitably there's about, right now the numbers tell us that there's probably about 20% of students who are not suited to learning in an online environment. And the demographic, it's not even like focusing in on one demographic, it spans age, it spans ethnicity, it spans majors. So they're really the propensity to be able to learn, to be able to interact, especially to engage in social interaction in synchronous and asynchronous environments, is really where we should be looking, and what can be done to identify those students who have the highest propensity of succeeding, but also which of the support mechanisms the university is using are succeeding and which ones are failing. So it's approaching two different sets of data that are operating at the same time, because part of it's identifying the students, part of it is identifying what's not working at the university, and then what's working very, very well at the university.
Taha, anything to add there?
No, I mean, I think the point that I really loved and I failed to mention before, along with engagement, it's this idea of intervention, right? Where can we see students slipping, and how can we, I mean, a lot of the major inefficiencies that happen in the K-12 spaces, like the need for remediation. Well, the need for remediation is is actually not the, it's an effect of the actual problem, which is the resource didn't hit the need immediately. That's why we need to remediate. And so the data is giving us really great insights about how do we support kids ahead of time, or how do we support kids as they need it. I think if you think of it in the really traditional model, right? A student would take a test on Friday, and then a teacher would take another week to grade it. And then a week later, the teacher would realize, hey, like that kid struggles with Pythagorean theorem. Well, guess what? Now we're like way beyond that, and you're missing the fundamentals, right? But now we're at an opportunity where we can get that data quicker, so we can do the intervention quicker. And so eliminating kind of the need for remediation. And that is a huge inefficiency in the education system. And we're excited that we now have the data to really tackle the problem.
Yeah, it's a great point. Ciara, anything that is burning for you?
I did have a bit of a question, but I don't know if it's too, we'll save it off topic. But I was just curious kind of how, if anyone had any thoughts on how like industry crosses over into this, especially if there was like an example of like an organization or stories where like it is more in sync, because a lot of themes like ROI on education, or like the value of co-op internship in the journey, or workforce development, like just if there's any examples of like the data actually, I assume it's a challenge, working well together. Yeah, organization stories, examples just coming from that lens.
Anything you can add there, Brady?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of specific examples. I I mean, there's always a bit of an injection of industry into this because industry is in one way or another facilitating the data, either by creating it or storing it, and just being the base technology layer where all this is occurring. But yeah, in terms of the interoperability from one side to the other, yeah, I can't really point to any specific examples of kind of how it's working. Yeah, that's tough.
That's what I was curious. I was like, I haven't seen the example of working well, but I was like, maybe the three of you have, that'd be something to kind of be like a lighthouse to look at for a good example.
It'll be stewing in Brady's head for a little while now, so he'll no doubt ping you when something comes up. It's a great question. So I've exhausted all of your time, and it's been awesome to reconnect with everyone. Taha, Phil, Brady, thank you so much, and for Sierra and Michaela for joining us. Always such insightful commentary. You guys are doing such stellar work in your respective fields. Are very accomplished in your respective fields, and we wish you every success in the work that you're doing. And thank you for making the time and for just introducing yourselves and sharing your insights, and keep up the great work. So thanks for joining us this morning, afternoon, wherever afternoons in your world.
Thank you for having us.
Cheers, guys.
Yes, thank you, Warren.